Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 31. By faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace. Now there's only two women mentioned in the list of the faithful in Hebrews chapter 11. Sarah, the wife of Abraham, and Rahab, a prostitute. Two women as far apart from each other as possible. One was a faithful servant of God, the other a woman who sold her body to men for their pleasure. She wasn't an Israelite or the family of Abraham. She was definitely an outsider, both in heritage and in character. The fact that Rahab makes God's list here is significant to understanding the character of God and the character of faith itself. Too many people make the mistake of wanting to skim over certain places in the Bible, and the story of Rahab is one of them. People will read through the little part that we see in the Bible about Rahab and say, well, she was a harlot, she was a prostitute, so why would we spend any time reading or studying or thinking about her? As we will see as we get farther down into this study tonight, Rahab was kind of like Saul, in that both of them were doing things that were tremendously sinful. Her selling her body as a prostitute to men, and Saul persecuting the Christians. But when we read through these stories, we need to bear in mind what happened to these two. How God changed their lives. And the Apostle Paul, one of the most well looked up to apostles in the Bible today. Rahab has the same kind of position, in that you can look at the life that Rahab lived before this story took place, and then you can see the immense mercy and grace that God has towards us. I have heard a lot of people make the comment that they just didn't think they could be saved because, boy, God knows everything I've done in my life. There's no way He's going to forgive me. But you go through the Bible and you read stories such as Saul and of Rahab, and you will come to realize God will forgive anything if you change your life and turn to Him. Last week we recounted the fall of the city of Jericho, Israel's first conquest upon entering the land of Canaan. Israel's faith in conquering this city was not the only faith that God honored in the fall of the city, and it's here that we meet Rahab. Now for our story, we go to the book of Joshua. Joshua chapter 2, in verse 1, the story begins, and Joshua the son of Nun sent out of Shittim 2 men to spy secretly, saying, go view the land, even Jericho. And they went and came into an harlot's house named Rahab, and lodged there. Now this brings up a couple questions already at the very beginning. Why did the spies go directly to a prostitute's house? Now, being a spy, they had to know that being caught meant immediate death, because the king of Jericho and everybody there had already heard about Israel and how God was with them, how He had brought them out of Egypt, and how He had helped them conquer armies and cities. So why would they go to a prostitute's house? They would have to ask somebody how to get there and where it was at. But why would the spies go to a prostitute's house? All it would take would be one person to inform on them, and they would have been captured and killed. I would believe that it had to be divine intervention on God's part to show them where to go and to tell them to find the house of the harlot, Rahab. How else would they know to go there? And why would Rahab accept these men because they had to tell her what they were there for. I mean, two men show up at a prostitute's house and they're not wanting a physical relationship with her. They're not wanting sex or anything. They had to tell her why they were there. So why would Rahab agree to this and agree to help them at the risk of her own life? But God had to have known that Rahab knew of his help with Israel and that she believed in God and his power. As we will discover later on in this study, everybody in Jericho knew what had happened with the people from Israel, how that God had evidently been on their side and had guided them through and helped them to overcome armies and towns and what have you. So when the people of Israel showed up outside the walls of Jericho, everybody knew what it meant. God must be going to help Israel destroy this city. Rahab knew that too. But as with everyone else, she had heard the stories from other people of what had happened, of how God was with the people of Israel. And as we will discover, out of the whole of the inhabitants of Jericho, Rahab was the only one that made that decision to change her life. She knew what was coming. So she believed in the power of God. She knew that how God was helping the people of Israel and knew that if they attacked a city, they would win. And in those days, when someone destroyed a city, they usually killed everybody in it, except for maybe some that they would take for slaves now and then. So she was willing to risk her life in the hopes that she could be spared. But she already had the faith to believe in God and was trying to change her life. In verses 2 through 7, and it was told the king of Jericho, saying, Behold, there came men in hither tonight of the children of Israel to search out the country. And the king of Jericho sent unto Rahab, saying, Bring forth the men that are come to thee, which are entered into thine house, for they be come to search out all the country. And the woman took the two men and hid them, and said thus, There came men unto me, but I wist not whence they were. And it came to pass about the time of shutting of the gate, when it was dark, that the men went out. Whither the men went, I wot not. Pursue after them quickly, for ye shall overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof of the house, and hid them with the stalks of flax which she had laid in order upon the roof. And the men pursued after them the way to Jordan unto the fords, and as soon as they which pursued after them were gone, they shut the gate. So Rahab lied to the people that showed up at her house, the army, militia, or whoever it was that the king had sent there. But someone had to have seen these men and suspicioned who they were. One, because they were strangers. And they saw them go into Rahab's house. But they didn't see them come out. So they went to the king and said, I think there's two spies have come into the city to look us over. So the king, he sends people to Rahab's house to question her about it, and she lied to them. Now, a lot of people put forth the question that, did God condone her lying and thoughts such as this? And that is not even addressed in the Bible. So it leads me to believe that there is nothing significant about this fact, or else it would have been covered in the Bible itself. But someone had to tell the king about the two men. We note in this little part of the story here that Rahab is the only person in Jericho that we hear named. Even the king is not called by name here. We realize the huge risk that Rahab was taking, but her concern is not just for herself, but her entire family. See, Rahab knew what was probably coming, but she was not just thinking about saving her own skin. She wanted to try to the best of her ability to save her whole family. So Rahab already is showing a deep faith in God and what He can do. In verse 9, as it continues, in 9 through 13, and she said unto the men, I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you come out of Egypt, and what you did unto the two kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. And as soon as we had heard these things, our hearts did melt. Neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. Now listen closely to this part. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. Now therefore I pray you, swear unto me by the Lord, since I have showed you kindness, that you will also show kindness unto my father's house, and give me a true token, and that you will save alive my father and my mother, and my brethren and my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. So Rahab, after hiding the two spies on her roof, when she gets rid of the men that are looking for them, she goes up and tells them what she has done. And she lets them know that everybody knows what has been happening. Everybody has heard the stories of how God is on your side and how you are winning every battle. And since you have showed up here, everyone's heart is filled with fear. So fear came upon all of them. But it seems that Rahab, a prostitute, one of the lowest people in the city, is the only one out of all the city of Jericho that was willing to change her life and turn to God. Now think about that. Everyone in the city knew what had been happening. They knew that God was with Israel. They knew that He was keeping His protective hand about them, and that He was helping them in their conquest. So they knew that when the people of Israel showed up there outside the city of Jericho, that they were going to be next. And they all knew what that meant. If God was on their side, they didn't stand a chance. But yet, of everyone in that city, from the king down, the only person that decided to change her life was Rahab. After hearing the stories of how God was with the people of Israel, she realized that He is God of all. As she said, He is God in heaven and in earth. They had to realize this too. I mean, you would think common sense would tell you. But yet she was the only one that was willing to change her life. Sometimes that is what it takes for us. We have to make a big change in our life when we become a Christian. She had to quit being a prostitute and selling her body. She had to quit being friends with the people that she was accustomed to being around. She had to change her entire way of living and start obeying the laws of God. But she was willing to do this. because she knew that when you accepted God and you obeyed His will, that God would protect you. And she was praying for this, that in so doing that she could save not only herself but her entire family from what was coming. In verses 14 through 21, well, first, Rahab's words here help us understand the development of her faith in this time of crisis. She, as well as the others, had heard how God delivered the Israelites, how He miraculously sustained them in victory, and she is convinced that Jehovah, the God of Israel, is about to conquer her city as well. And she wants to enter into an agreement with these spies and their God. She believes that God can save her and her family, and she is willing to beg for mercy. In verses 14 through 21, we see where the spies agree to her request with restrictions. As it usually is with God, I will do this for you, but you have to do this for me. And that is what had happened with Rahab. In verse 14, and the men answered her, our life for years, if ye utter not this our business, and it shall be, when the Lord hath given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with thee. Then she let them down by a cord through the window, for her house was upon the town wall, and she dwelt upon the wall. Now I want to stop there for just a moment. Remember this verse, how she let them down on a cord outside the wall, because her house was made into the wall. The walls were usually 20 feet thick or more. But her house was on the wall. That's how she was able to let them down so they could escape with this cord. So remember that for later in the lesson. In verse 16, she said unto them, get you to the mountain, lest the pursuers meet you, and hide yourselves there 3 days until the pursuers be returned, and afterward may ye go your way. In verse 17, and the men said unto her, we will be blameless of this thine oath which thou hast made us swear. Behold, when we come into the land, thou shalt bind this line of scarlet thread in the window, which thou didst let us down by. And thou shalt bring thy father and thy mother and thy brethren and all thy father's household home unto thee. And it shall be that whosoever shall go out of the doors of thy house into the street, his blood shall be upon his head, and we will be guiltless. And whosoever shall be with thee in the house, his blood shall be on our head, if any hand be upon him. And if thou utter this our business, then we will be quit of thine oath, which thou hast made us to swear. And she said, according unto your words, so be it. And she sent them away, and they departed. And she bound the scarlet line in the window. So she had some particular instructions that she had to follow to the letter if she wanted to be saved and to save her family. They told her, you must get your whole family into your house. And they must stay there. Because if anybody leaves the house when we come in to attack the city, they will be killed along with everybody else. But it seems from what we read that she was not even allowed to tell her family what was going to happen, of how they were going to attack and conquer Jericho. But she had to have that scarlet cord tied in her window as a sign of where she was. And the spies told her that if you keep all these things that we have told you to do, then you and your family will be spared when we overthrow the city. She or none of her family was allowed to tell of the spies' activities or plans, if they even knew it. She had to convince her family to come to her own home and remain there throughout the invasion. She had to leave the cord in her window until it was over. If she failed to do all these, would she have been saved? Probably not. But recall her words. According to your words, so be it. She agreed to their terms and their conditions that they told her. This is the voice of faith. She knew that God was the Almighty, the All-Powerful. And she knew that if she wanted to be saved, she was going to have to follow what they told her to do. And she told them, as you say it, that's the way it's going to be. This is strong faith for someone that had lived in a city so sinful. But from the reports that she had heard, along with everybody else, she had come to the realization that the idols and everything that they worshipped was not going to do them a bit of good. That the one true God was on the side of the Israelites. Rahab did not just believe in the existence of God, she believed that God was bringing the Israelites into the promised land. She only had the reports of others to go by. Therefore, she was walking by faith, not by sight. In John chapter 20 and verse 29, it reads, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And remember her confession of faith that she had already made in verse 11. The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. So we can see here how strong her faith was already. Had not heard God's word taught to her, but only from what she had seen and what she had heard from reports from other people, just like all the inhabitants of Jericho. But she had realized that God was on their side. And she made the decision herself to change her life. In verse 20 down through verse 25, now excuse me, now we skip over to the 6th chapter of Joshua. And here we read of when the Israelites actually conquered Jericho, and how that Rahab was remembered, and that the spies did exactly what they had told her that they would do. So Joshua chapter 6, verses 20 through 25. So the people shouted when the priests blew with the trumpets. This is after the 7th pass. And it came to pass, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. Now let's pause here for a minute. What did I tell you to remember from earlier? Rahab's house was in the wall. One way of using space when the walls were that thick was to build houses in them. Remember, Rahab let the spies down on a cord out of her window. They went down outside the wall of the city, and that's how they were able to escape. Now, when the trumpets blew and the people shouted and the walls fell down, the Bible does not tell us this specifically, but that portion of the wall where her house was could not have fallen. If it had, it would have killed Rahab and her whole family. But that scarlet cord that the spies told her to leave in her window as a mark is what saved her, because it was there, which I thought was a very interesting point in the story. Verse 21, and they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and ass, with the edge of the sword. As we spoke of earlier, most times when an army conquered a city, they killed everyone and everything. You remember, even God commanded that when they took a city, that they were to kill every man, woman, child, and beast in that city, that none were to survive. But Joshua had said unto the two men that had spied out the country, Go into the harlot's house, and bring out thence the woman and all that she hath, as ye swore unto her. And the young men that were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brethren and all that she had. And they brought out all her kindred and left them without the camp in Israel, without the camp of Israel. And they burnt the city with fire and all that was therein. Only the silver and the gold and the vessels of brass and of iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. So every single person in that city was destroyed and then was burned. Because after they had went in and killed every person and beast in that city by the sword, then it was set on fire and burned. All except a prostitute. Now that is something when you stop to think about it. You've got a king and all of his court. And I'm sure there were people that were pretty high politically, judges and lawyers and about anybody you could imagine, people that were well respected in a city, in government and politics and what have you, businessmen, all destroyed because not one single person other than Rahab even thought about changing their life and turning to God. They had seen all the proof, as everyone else had, that God was with the people from Israel. They knew what had happened in all their travels, how that they had conquered everybody they went up against. They knew how God had parted the sea. They knew how that they had been fed in the desert with manna from heaven. They had heard how that they had had water that come out of rocks. And with all this, they had to know that the only true God was with them. But yet they were so stubborn that nobody would agree to change their life. Sadly, we see this a lot today. I mistakenly used to make the mistake of saying that I didn't think you could ask anybody if they wanted to go to heaven or hell, and I didn't think you'd find anybody that said, I'll just go to hell. But I found out there are those in this world today that will tell you that. I don't care. I'm going to live the way I want to, and I'm going to enjoy myself while I'm here. If I go to hell, so be it. I have had people actually tell me that. But to know how powerful that God is and still refuse to change, that is incomprehensible to me, why anyone would be that way. We all know how short our life is here on earth. We're just here for a little while. Do you know the people that lived 200 years ago, 100 years ago? The only ones that might remember might be people in the family that might recall stories of, well, your great-grandfather did this or that, or your great-grandmother. Other than that, nobody knows them. Nobody's really going to remember us. unless it's a very few that we were close to in life. Stories might be told about us. So why would anybody take the short time that we are here and risk a soul's eternity? We all realize there's only two decisions for us to make. Do we want to go to heaven or to hell? We've read the stories of Lazarus and the rich man, and the Bible tells us that they will be wailing and gnashing of teeth, and how terrible it would be in hell with the fire and the brimstone and the pain every day. The rich man begged for Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and touch his tongue because he was in such agony. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot about either one, but it does tell us what heaven will be like. There will be no pain or tears, no sickness, no death, no sorrow. As that old song goes that we sing a lot of times, all will be joy in that land. So why would anyone risk their soul's eternity by not obeying God? Rahab, as we learn, through her tremendous faith, her and her family was saved. But what happened afterwards? Joshua 6 tells us that Rahab continued to live in Israel as a servant of the true God. She is also mentioned in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 5. She married a man named Salmon, who bore a son named Boaz, the husband of a woman named Ruth, a name I'm sure you're familiar with, who was the mother of Obed, the grandmother of Jesse, the great-grandmother of David. So this former prostitute that sold her body to men, through her faith, turned her life around to the point that this former prostitute was the great-great-grandmother of David in the seed of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. Now, isn't that something that is amazing to think of? You know, I mentioned Saul earlier, how much he changed and become such a great apostle, preaching the word of Christ. Even though he was imprisoned and tortured and beaten. And throughout it all, he never wavered from spreading the word of God the way that he was supposed to. And here, out of an entire city, the one woman saved was a prostitute. But she turned her life around to the point that she ended up being the great-great-grandmother of David. I think it is an amazing story in itself. Her story is a wonderful exhibition of God's grace. From a Jewish perspective, she had 3 strikes against her already. She was a woman who had no rights. She was a Canaanite, and she was a prostitute. But with all this going against her, all she had to do was to change her life and turn to God. And look what happened. She not only saved herself, she saved her entire family and all that they had. Even though Rahab was an unlikely candidate for salvation, God's grace had reached down to her. The fact that she is called Rahab the harlot even after her conversion underscores God's abundant grace towards sinners. The spies didn't know when they went there that God had a mission for them besides spying, but he did. Sometimes we go somewhere on an errand and God has another purpose, to use us to bring salvation to someone. It is evident from the story that we read that Rahab had come to have faith in God even before the spies showed up at her house. She already realized what it meant. And as she told the spies, she already knew that their God was a God in heaven and in earth. To be saved, she had to break away from her people, her culture, her source of income, something that is never easy to do. But by her faith, she made the break. And it's still true today. Saving faith means making a distinct break from this evil world so that we often stand out as weird in the world's eyes. Remember what Jesus said, you are a peculiar people. We are looked on as peculiar because we are Christians and we live according to the teachings of Christ. But we must always remember, there is nothing that man can say or do that can cause us to lose our soul, that can cause us to go to hell. Each person, each individual has their own decisions to make. And just as Rahab, in the face of all the controversy and everything that she was up against, she made the right decision. And we see how it worked out for her. So Rahab the harlot ended up becoming an ancestor of Jesus Christ. What a great testimony this is to the grace of God. I often have a lot of people that when they make comments to me about the life they lived or whatever, I will refer them to Saul. But I need to refer them to Rahab also. If people that were living the lives that Saul and Rahab lived can be saved, then we can all be saved. I hope this study has been beneficial to you in some way. I look forward very